Welcome back. This time we are going to talk about China. China is not a communist regime. It's actually a state capitalism. It's a state where the government controls the economy. And by the government, I mean the Communist Party, but that is not that communist nowadays, not since the 80s. But this is this is not a show about political philosophy. So let's mention some characteristics of what China has been since the 80s. Is China was the engine of global growth after the 2008 recession. That those were the times where Hu Jintao was the president. But also China it has been famous for the repression of Uyghurs and other minorities, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So it's a mixed bag. Other things we have to take into account is that China is the second economy. So when politicians tells you Russia is our most dangerous enemy, well, only if we allow it to have leverage on China, because Russia, despite all their natural resources, is the economy number 11 due to the kleptocracy that is in charge. And Iran is not even in the top 25 economies, so let's not be ridiculous. Another thing we have to take into account is that China is too interconnected. The Asian economy is too interconnected for us to believe we could put one economy against the other, or that we could attack China and leave the other economies unharmed. That's too naive, and that could be very counterproductive. Now, another thing is that in the short term, China depends on the West and the United States, but in the long term, its goals are directed to the global South. An example of that is the Belt and Road Initiative. And so our goals don't have to collide necessarily. We'll talk about a bit more about that in a little while. Then, as I mentioned before, the best moments of the Chinese economy were were led by Hu Jintao. But Hu Jintao was unceremoniously removed from the Communist Party in the 20th Congress. And Xi Jinping represents a different brand of the Communist Party, one where ultranationalism is very well represented. This faction has sided with Putin, especially in the BRICS alliance. In the BRICS, normally Xi sides with Putin, but against, for instance, the Brazil and India, who represent the non-aligned faction. But in the end, China has always sided with its own interests, as for instance, in the case of diversifying their energy suppliers and siding more with Kazakhstan's energy projects than with the Siberian project. Putin has been pursuing in order to get the economy and the Chinese and Russian economy even more interlinked. What are the what are the tools we can use? What we can use is China's economic woes, and these economic woes are represented basically in three sections, in three items. The first is the property sector. In order to get those spectacular growth rates, the Chinese leaders have been neglecting, turning a blind eye on cases like Evergrande, which engage on over leveraged construction projects like the ones we had, even worse than the ones we had before the Great Recession. And one image of that is the ghost cities with construction projects nobody's going to inhabit, probably never will ever, probably will never inhabit, because multiple reasons that are behind housing decisions. The matter is that this kind of losses in the property sector take years, may take China easily 1 decade to absorb. Another one is overcapacity. Overcapacity, by this means a heavy investment in manufacturing, expecting to sell the excellence, to export the excellence to trading partners. And why is this a problem for us? Because that excess capacity will not just disappear if we ignore it, as Biden has been doing, because China always has what is called the nuclear option. If we raise barriers, he could always use a huge devaluation, something China has not done in a very long while, and this may unleash a trade war with even higher tariffs, of which the only winner is going to be Putin. So we have to help China deal with this overcapacity because it's in our best interest. That, of course, if your goal, as I propose, is to isolate Putin, because if you don't want, you are going to be in this war or trade war where you are going to harm other economies, where you are going to push not just Xi, but other economies to the Putin side and to Putin side. And in the end, we are going to be the losers. Another problem is the demographic crisis. That, for instance, Jared Diamond portrays in the case of China, because it's the case of Japan, because China, as Japan, is very reluctant to fill the gap with immigration. And as Paul Krugman noticed in a past article, this could be very dangerous, because the more reluctant we are to deal with Xi, because if you deal with Xi, you are weak on China, according to the current narrative, the more likely is that you are going to push Xi to the side of Putin. And Putin, as I mentioned before in other video, wants to imprint a privateer standard in our relations with China. So we need a new narrative. And before going to that, let me leave you with the second part of our newscast.
Good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and we continue with the main headlines of this hour. Among other national news, Alabama will unveil a statue of Foundation for Moral Law's original champion and former Senate candidate Roy Moore in atonement for charges of child sexual abuse, judicial misconduct, and tax fraud. These charges were raised in 2017 and unfairly affected his political career, since child abuse and judicial misconduct were always protected by the Alabama Constitution. Alaska, the most prolific state for serial killers, has decided to tackle budget woes by commuting the latter's life in prison sentences to community service. If President Putin can put Russian serial killers back on the street after 6 months of military service, why can't we commute their sentences to 1 year of community service? Asked rhetorical Governor Mike Dunleavy. In Massachusetts, Natalie Portman protested stem cell research made by the Uppsala University Hospital to reverse disabilities as an example of disability shaming. The protest included a celebration of diabetes and obesity against what she denominated fat shaming. Wisconsin unveiled the first restricting map drawn in more than 3 dimensions. The Supreme Court ruled that there is nothing in the U.S. Constitution against a redistricting map in more than 3 dimensions, even if the plaintiffs lack the tools to examine it thoroughly. In Oklahoma, worrying answers to high school history tests reveal that 51% of students believe the United States fought with the Germans against the Russians in the Second World War, 47% that Ronald Reagan was president during the Civil War, and 59% could mention only one member of the Supreme Court, Abraham Lincoln. Alabama Senator Katie Britt will once again give the rebuttal to President Biden's State of the Union in 2025. From her speech, which took place in her Alabama residence kitchen, new excerpts have been disclosed. Moms and pops are worried about the future. Communities aren't safe. We pray for God's guidance. Our families are hurting because Joe Biden refuses to pay President Trump's $454 million New York fine and his legal bills, leaving that crushing burden on the shoulders of the people. The people are suffering. Sponsored by Jill Stein for president, we dare you to believe that with your vote, it's possible that Jill can jump from 1% to 51%, so Trump will not be reelected. Jill's psychiatric diagnosis will bring her into harmony with her spirit guides. Jill's bicycle song will rank #1 in Rolling Stone. Jill will align her chakras and yours. Believe, an ad approved by Jill Stein for president and the American Psychiatric Association. Chip in. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.
Now, let's go to welcome back. Let's go to Biden's policies. In theory, his policy compete with China, constrain Russia, sounds good. The problem is that he has been doing just the opposite. Ignore China, provoke China, and push it to Putin. And Putin wants a militaristic approach that of which the only loser is going to be the United States. Let me be clear here. Not everything Biden has done is wrong. For instance, the chip ban was on grounds of national security or on preserving the top-of-the-art technology in chips was a correct decision. If it's based on national security, it's a kind of ban or restriction on commerce, I not just can live with, but which I approve. The problem is that by rationing military aid to Zelensky, we have been strengthening Putin, elevating him to the rank of senior partner. Because if Putin wins in Ukraine, that will show China. And let's remember here the Paul Krugman's advice that may show Xi Jinping that he can compensate for poor economic results with geopolitical gains. In this case, it would be Taiwan and the South China Sea. Then another thing that contradicts this Biden's policy is our sales of weapons to Taiwan and the Philippines. Because these two countries, different from Ukraine in the case of Russia, don't have a chance to stop China if China responds militarily. Where the effects, unfortunately, of the Ukraine war has been an increased trade between China and Russia that only has elevated Russia even more. The same way, the way we have abandoned Africa to Russia and its military, paramilitary groups like the former Wagner group, which has increased instability in Africa just to secure resources and markets, not for Russia, for China. Then we have the effect of our Netanyahu policy. I'm not going to say Israeli policy because it's not in the best interest of Israel, as you can see in my video about Israel, but in our Netanyahu policy on ASEAN, ASEAN, because the way we have treated Netanyahu has taught Muslim countries in this Far Asian group that we have a double standard. Whatever Netanyahu wants, he gets. On the other side, if you trust if you are Zelensky and you are so naive to trust the United States, you get rationing. So in the last poll made in this ASEAN group about elites, economic and political elites, this is the first year they have sided with China over the United States. And because of the interlinks between the Chinese and Asian economies, that means that it has been our foreign policy that had caused that effect. So, having said that, what can Kamala Harris do if she is elected? Well, number one, she needs a new narrative where the goal is to isolate Putin. You need your narrative should be turning China into Japan in the 1980s and 90s, instead of a military foe that on a stupid policy that only pushes Xi in the direction of Putin. then our relationship and Europe's relationship with Japan with rosy in those years? No, but it never turned into a into military tensions. It could be solved every time Japan violated the quotas into a retaliation, a new adjustment of the treaty, and life went on. And that's why to the scenario to which we should aim in the case of China, especially since the Chinese IBs go to different niches. So the Chinese EVs go to are cheaper, go to lower income and to a lower income niche, while the American EVs go to more expensive, more to a higher income segment of market. So we can use quotas to limit, contain the effect of China and play with those quotas in order to get what should be our most immediate goal, to end the Ukraine war. And the country that can achieve that with the least carnage possible is China, because China is still the main buyer of Russia's oil. And if China interrupted the trade between those two countries, Putin would have nowhere else to go. He cannot get back to the West. So we should use that leverage and avoid the huge cost of having China and Russia on the same side militarily. Then another thing where we could make concessions to China is in giving it a say on the World Trade Organization. It's true that China in the past has not been the best in compliance of World Trade Organization rules, the GATT rules. But the matter is that nowadays, for instance, devaluation is not the top factor of their competitiveness. It may be more the case of subsidies, but we are also using subsidies in competing with China, and even Europe has complained about some of these subsidies in for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act. So why not playing with that? And our price should be having Putin out of Ukraine and freeze in Taiwan, in the relations between Taiwan and between China and Taiwan, and China and its South China Sea neighbors. Then another way field where we could get an understanding is the global South debt, which after the pandemic reached catastrophic levels. We could adopt the Brookings Institution proposal of a new Brady plan for debt, because it is important, because remember that in the long term, China aims at the global South. And you may say, well, but China is doing very, it is deceiving the global South in a debt trap scheme. Well, I have read reports that actually they use these loans to secure resources, and to trap these countries in unpayable debt. But I have also read reports where, with the issue of resources aside, China's loans are not that different from the West loans. The problem is that they are so secret that we cannot say one thing or the other. Then, when it comes to representation, another thing that could cost us very little is the more representation in the IMF and the World Bank. Since their foundation, the head of the IMF has been normally a European, and the head of the World Bank has been an American. But we could let these groups have a better say in these institutions, so that they don't create their parallel institutions inside BRIC or another zone that may inside. If the Chinese succeed at creating this yuan zone, with the yuan not as a deposit of reserve but as the dominant trade currency, we could end up making these institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, as well as the WTO, irrelevant. What would play excellently in favor of Putin, because that would allow Putin to avoid sanctions. Then another point where we could have common ground is nuclear stability. China believes it's entitled to inherit the global south, and they don't want to inherit a nuclear wasteland. That's why they have sent warnings to Putin against using nuclear weapons, strategic or not, in Ukraine. They don't want a nuclear conflagration because they feel their time. Right now they are the second economy, but their time will come, and they don't want that spoiled by Putin's ambitions. Then another one that where Putin and Xi and Putin's ambitions on the Arctic are collide is in climate. So China has been heavy investment in climate, and they are interested in making progress, even though it's China and India, it's under India and China, the two main polluters. So there is another field where we could get established collaboration, share technology in order to make progress, because these problems are not going to go away just because we ignore it. We ignore them. Just consider the case of nuclear. Our stupid foreign policy of pushing Xi toward Putin has led the Xi Jinping, and remember that Xi Jinping is still trying to displace the Hu Jintao people, so he's very nervous, and we have made it even more nervous about nuclear, because we are arming their neighbors, and they feel that they might be next, especially if Trump is elected. So that's why they have increased their nuclear capabilities, where we should be going in the opposite direction. Now, this is the best case. This is the best case scenario. This is what we should be offering. Will she take it? I don't know, because if the answer is not, we will have to prepare for eventual war, not with Xi, but with Xi plus Putin. And why we know it's war? Because that's the way Putin understands foreign policy, destabilization, as in the case of Moldova, Georgia, and other European countries, and in the case of Africa, or war, like in the case of Ukraine. So, but the matter is that we, with a new narrative, we could have a more intelligent China policy. And because of China's wars, we could at least gain time while we reward this China with relations, this foreign policy, and isolate militaristic options like Putin's. Now, you say, well, but if there are all these problems with Biden and Kamala, why not Trump? Well, because what Trump is, would be worse. Just look at the Brookings assessment. His huge tariffs and his selected crook isolationism would only put China on the side of Putin and increase Putin's leverage on that relation and in their relation with the United States. That even would put NATO, Europe, in a very weak spot, and they they might start seeking accommodation with this new reality where the United States has turned its back on Europe. So, and for instance, when we need rare earth materials that we are not producing, and these rare earth materials are produced, let's say, in Africa, and they are not ruled by rules of supply and demand anymore, we would have no way of complaining. That's the way it is. But China would get this country attached with a new loan. Putin would send its enforcement group by courting the government or the opposition, creating instability, installing a strong man, and then no matter what we offer for those rare materials, we will not have them. So I have spoken about Trump's tariffs in my previous video about the economy. So for more on that, I would like to ask you to go to that video. So you may ask finally if I am going to invoke FDR here too. And yes, I will. Because FDR, Roosevelt, also had to deal with a foe that was on the rising, the Soviet Union. And his policy was not to antagonize the Soviet Union unnecessarily. He had to show the Soviets strength, and and he did. It was unfortunately Truman who followed the Hawks' advice that led to unnecessary confrontation and lost opportunities, especially after Stalin died and Nikita Khrushchev rose to power. So we could learn from FDR here. Yes, we can. But we need a new narrative, and otherwise you are going to always look weak before the Republican narrative of antagonizing China, of showing China who is the boss, and all those stupid things that could end up very bad for us. And having said that, thank you.